welcome to another episode of Disrupt Ed TV. This week we are joined by the fabulous Carolyn Stuart. She is both a colleague and an old friend of mine, someone who I have enjoyed working with in my past life as working on the N4L advisory, and someone who I've always considered both a friend and a mentor. Carolyn is also the author of the recent book, The Leader's Suitcase, which will be telling us a little bit about today. And today really is an opportunity for us to discuss leadership, what it takes to lead ourselves, what it takes to lead others, but also what it takes to look after ourselves along on that journey. Carolyn, how are you?
Kia ora, thank you. It's so lovely to be here. And just want to give a shout out at the start, Claire, just to you for doing this work, because I know how busy you are as principal, because I did that for 12 years, and I know that it's a really full-on job. And also you've got other responsibilities with your kahuiako, and you're still managing to fit a little bit of extra in. So it is delightful to be here.
I always see it as a bit of a win-win. Part of me having these conversations because I get to benefit from them. And I mean, I've always sort of thought if you can do it in such a way that other people might be able to benefit as well, it's little effort for a whole lot of gain. And I know that's a bit of a theme that comes through in your work in terms of making leadership something that is actually sustainable and something we can do. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and maybe a little bit about the book that you've recently published? And I know there might be another one in the pipeline.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so I've always worked in education up until actually 2013. So I was a teacher for a really long time, and I never really aspired to be a principal or anything like that, which sounds a bit odd, but I've always just loved being in classrooms and with children. But as sometimes fate would have it, I ended up in a rural school. I was actually the deputy principal, and the principal left, and I ended up being appointed there. And so suddenly I was thrust into educational leadership in a way that I really wasn't looking for, but really enjoyed, because what I know is that when leaders lead well, they actually impact the whole school, not just as a teacher you impact your class, but as an education leader you can actually impact a much greater number of children. And I think that's what's always driven the work that I do. So I was principal at Southbridge School in Canterbury, which has a famous All Black, which you can all guess who that was, Dan Carter. And then I did a year in the ministry in 2006 with the Student Management Systems team, which, Claire, we were talking earlier on, that's where you and I first connected. Around the MLE group, remember that?
Oh my goodness, so long ago.
So long ago. And then I became principal. I was appointed principal at Tower Intermediate in Wellington, and I was there until 2013 when my career took an unexpected and unplanned pivot, when I was asked to be on the leadership team of Network for Learning, or N4L as we now know it, which was a startup IT company that the government had set up in order to fix the fibre connectivity in schools. And I took the role because we were incredibly frustrated at our school by the lack of connectivity, and we were a city school, and you couldn't even begin to imagine what they must have been like for rural. But also I was quite intrigued as to what it would be like as an education leader, then moving across into the more corporate IT sector. And so that's what I did.
Yeah, and an incredible opportunity to look at leadership in all its forms, isn't there? Like, I think we often underestimate how many skills we have as a school leader that actually can transfer into that world beyond. But then, of course, there's also some differences as well. So what are some of your biggest learnings about being a leader and making leadership sustainable? Well, aspirational in the first place. Like, I think we've got a real challenge that there's not always people wanting to jump into those school leadership roles. And I think we've got a real responsibility to make sure that it's not only actually is a sustainable job to do, but actually that it also is seen as something that people would want to do. I think so often we're hearing of stories of burnout, overwhelm, the challenges that we all know exist within the system. And there's no question that we all have challenges with the system and potentially within our context as well. But I do believe there's things that we can do and ways we can approach our role that do make it maybe more sustainable and more appealing. What are some of your learnings that you've gathered along the way?
So yeah, thanks, Claire. So I just want to state out here in the front, I don't think it's ever been more difficult to be an educational leader than what it is today. I've worked with a lot of schools throughout the year. I work with lots of educational leaders, lots of principals, and it can be really tough. One principal said to me, we used to have kind of one tricky family in the school. We've now got one tricky family per class. And so the complexity that principals are dealing with is, or not just principals, but educational leaders is dealing with, has never been as great. And therefore, it's never been a more important time for us to actually proactively approach the way that we lead. Through the COVID years, it was and for very good reasons, people were reacting all the time because it was unknown territory. It was kind of like, you felt like and in lots of ways, I was an observer for a lot of this, but it was like you just watch people going from one fire and they'd kind of get that under control, and then the next fire would ignite. And it seems like for quite a few years, that's been the role of leaders, is just to kind of put that fire and go to that fire, hopefully put it out, go to the next one. Or it's even a bit like, the other analogy I have is like that game in a gaming arcade where you've got those crocodiles that come out to get you, and you just whack one. It's whack-a-mole. And you literally, I've watched principals whack one mole and then the next one pops up. And so whilst during COVID that was probably unavoidable, we now actually have the opportunity to start to build our own resilience. And actually, I think there's a real responsibility for leaders now to be building the resilience of their staff. So we've kind of got to stop thinking about well-being as being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and start to think about, how do we build that well-being fence at the top of the cliff? And so that's sort of a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment. In 2021, I studied a diploma in positive psychology, which looks at how do you use a strengths-based approach to leadership? What are the evidenced research from the area of positive psychology that you can apply to leadership? Because actually, as leaders, we've got to learn how to thrive as leaders and not just survive. And so that was the first book that I wrote. So I've got 3 books actually in the pipeline. The first one. Oh my goodness! I know. How far too much to say for one book. The first book, and I've organised the book. I've called it the Leader Suitcase, and each book represents a different packing cell within the suitcase. And so the first packing cell, which is the first book that was published last September, that's the packing cell all about setting ourselves up for success. And it helps leaders engage with the theories from positive psychology and apply them to their leadership. And in fact, I guarantee that if leaders do a masterclass with me and apply just one of the strategies that we learn, their life will be incredibly different. And I know, leaders who've been through my masterclass, they just come back and like, we look at what your personal values are and how that shows up for you as a leader. And it's an easy way to actually become really authentic in how you lead. But not only that, we look at ways to actually navigate between negative and positive emotions. Like, we all have bad days, but it's actually what we do with that bad day. And even recently, I've been talking to a principal who said that he was finding it incredibly hard to be present on the sports field as he's watching his son at the weekend, because what's going on at school is constantly going through his head. And so today we talked about what are how might you use a declaration to actually manage the cognitive overload that he's carrying even into the weekend. So there's a whole lot of really small things that leaders can do that have a huge impact on their well-being. And then the other thing I'm doing with that is also making a series of videos that once a leader in a school's done the masterclass with me, they can then take that masterclass and deliver it to the people in their schools. Thus, they will build the resilience capability of all.
Because as we know, leaders exist right across our school population, don't they? We're not just talking about the principal. The principal has a very clear responsibility to lead a lot of this work. But what you're saying is it can be really powerful learning for absolutely every person, I think, that works within a school space.
Yeah, and especially schools that are innovative. So when I was principal at Tower Intermediate, there was a TLRI research project done on the school, looking at, how does innovation play out like successfully in a school. And what the research found was that every single person in the school felt empowered to lead, felt that it was okay to be innovative within their practice. And so that's another really essential thing, is that we actually set schools up, or set organisations up, so that people can innovate. Because the other big thinking that I'm doing at the moment is around, what is the impact of generative AI going to be on the work that we do? And it's going to be huge.
Yeah, absolutely massive. And we'll come back to that AI thing in a moment, because I know that's something we could probably spend a whole other episode on, but we'll talk about it a bit more in a moment. One thing that you talked about just before is that sense of people feeling like they're in a position to lead change themselves. One of my biggest learnings over the last sort of 6 years as a beginning principal has been never to presume people's sense of agency as a teacher or a leader, and recognizing that you need to do the groundwork with people to ensure that they recognize the agents that, and it can be really tricky, because I know you and I think we're probably born agentic. We were born thinking that, we have the permission to do things, and that we'll apologize, further along the way. And we've been proactive, and we've always seen it as our responsibility and our right to just, be responsive to our learners and to change things up. So I think we were probably came into teaching with that mindset of being a leader in our own classroom context and whatever position we've taken on. But we can't take that for granted, can we, in terms of thinking that people within our school have that sense of ownership and agency over their own well-being, over the learning, the teaching and learning design.
And I think that one of the mistakes that you and I make, I've made it, and you may not have made it, but I think for both of us, and a lot of people are involved in this DisruptEd community, we sit at the front of the curve of adoption. Like, we're the early adopters of technology and all sorts of things. But the majority of people working in schools are literally the early and late majority. And one of the things that I regret as principal was that I treated all my staff as though they were early adopters just like me, and they're not, right?
Yeah. No, I've definitely been on that learning curve as well. Leading an ICT PD contract for several years, that was a steep learning curve, but a really powerful one. That's made me recognize that it's why you start with the why. It's why you recognize the power of meeting people where they're at and taking them with you. You touched on this, the power and the potential of generative AI, and obviously with you now being stepped away from school leadership and having a little bit more sort of space, and I think the fact that you were working with Network for Learning, so you've had one foot in the education world and one foot very squarely in that sort of digital innovation space. What's some of your thinking about how we can leverage and lean into what's coming? Because as we said offline earlier, we're so busy day to day that we're not necessarily cognizant of what we're actually, the Pandora's box has opened. And we're having discussions maybe about students and AI and assessment, but we're not necessarily having the same conversations about how it could transform how we work and we operate as teachers and leaders.
And I think that it comes back to that main message at the front. Like, we need to figure out how we can move from being a reactive leader to a proactive leader. Like, how do we actually create and it does sit with well-being. It does actually sit with, if we actually need to get ourselves in order so that we can actually think past the present. It's that working on yourself and on the school as well as in the school, and on the schools, the AI space we're in at the moment. So I think the biggest thing is not to ignore it, like to actually get in amongst it, start to engage with the different AI tools. I've got the paid version of ChatGPT, and it's changing the way that I work. More than that, though, the thing I'm thinking about a lot at the moment is, how is that going to change the way that we lead? Because I know for me, probably why I popped up and ended up as principal of a school is like you, I've always been really innovative, but I've also always had really strong curriculum knowledge and real sense around how learning occurs, and it's sort of almost innate, right?
Yeah.
But in a world of AI, that cognitive expertise, which is often what causes us to be promoted as leaders, we're on a hiding to nothing, because generative AI has probably more expertise, has more expertise than we'll ever be able to accumulate in a lifetime. And
so us understanding how to access that and leverage it is going to be as important as the curriculum knowledge once was.
But also it's about thinking about what's that opportunity. Because actually, if I don't have to be like the cognitive leader, as it were, the expert in my field type leader, then actually I can spend more resource and more energy actually being the relational leader, which is the thing that generative AI is not going to be able to do as well. But here I said as well, not going to be able to do, because already we're seeing AI platforms coming out where you can actually say to AI, I've got this, this, and this on today. What do I need to do to be an empathic leader? And boom, back it comes and tells you a whole lot of things that you can do today.
Yeah.
So, and it's just, and it's all of this, there was a report that came out in January that predicted by the end of 2024, like that's the end of this year, 40% of people's jobs will have been significantly impacted by AI. So whether that's actually happening within our schools or happening within the communities that we serve. So for some people, the impact of generative AI is going to have a hugely positive impact on their lives. For others, it's going to mean they lose their jobs. And that's why it's just so incredibly important that at this time, we're actually leading ourselves, so that, because we are actually moving into a disruptive era, not caused by a pandemic, but actually caused by probably the biggest technological shift that we've ever seen in the whole history of the universe.
I'm really interested as well as school leaders. Like, I think we've been very good here at creating a lot of sandpit time for teachers and leaders to really play around in that generative AI space and seeing how it can make us more efficient and more effective. I think what we're yet to engage in, and maybe we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do it, is our first instinct is to say, how can I use AI to do what I've always done better, faster, more quickly and efficiently. We're not asking it yet how to do it completely differently. If you know what I mean, like we're sort of in that thing of we're using it as an enhancer at this point in time, and it's going to be interesting when we have the time, and not that we ever have the time and space. It's going to be important that we create the time and space to actually say, how can we use these technologies to completely think differently? Like, I think about the secondary context and the freaking over-reliance on timetables and structures, and it's because it's such an easy way to slice and dice up resources and time. Like, if we could lean into AI, for instance, to get rid of timetables, to get rid of structure, if we wanted to, we really could. And I don't think we're there yet, but it does make me ponder how we do that shift from enhancing to transforming.
And you also think about, I think about the amount of time, particularly secondary teachers, spend marking.
Yeah.
Well, if an AI could actually do your marking for you, then what opportunity does that actually give you in terms, because what we've known for years that marking in and of itself doesn't really make any difference. What makes a difference is the conversation you have with the learner and the next steps for the learning that's come out of the assessment that you've done. Well, if as a teacher, I'm not having to spend hours marking work, but I actually could repurpose those hours. Maybe I could make videos for students or something that they can engage in, which is like their next step of learning. And what is possible with all of that? I also think the other thinking that we don't do enough of is that change happens exponentially. And so that's like that hockey stick curve. So for a really long time, it feels like nothing's happening, but suddenly the curve rises and you get this big spike and everybody goes, oh, where did that come from? But it's actually been coming for years.
Yes.
And that's what we're actually dealing with AIs. We're actually on this incredibly steep rise now as it begins to impact us about everything that we do. And even the difference between writing my first book in January last year and writing my second book now, I mean, obviously I'm not using AI to write my second book, as tempting as it is, but I know the other day I was thinking about, how a chapter on, how to lead with empathy. So I dropped into ChatGPT and said, how do you lead with empathy? And boom, 10 bullet points came up. Oh, that's useful. That saved me a whole lot of time thinking. But then I said to the ChatGPT, what happens when when leaders don't lead with empathy? And suddenly, boom, there's 10 things that go wrong if you don't. And I looked at it and go, well, there's almost my chapter, all of the information I need now. I just need to craft it into something that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's these sorts of things that are there's negatives and positives. I sometimes wonder if I should even be writing another book.
I mean, our most powerful use of ChatGPT last year was we've always done incredible amounts of student voice gathering and student data, and we do every year and we try and make sure that there's a combination of scales, but also real voice in terms of spoken or written voice. And our ability to synthesize and not only we were using ChatGPT not only to synthesize it, but to also help us with if that, what then, sort of like, if that's what the data is telling us, what are the interventions that could help us? And it didn't prevent us from engaging into any of the research and evidence that we know is powerful and important. It just gave us some quick shortcuts into thinking a bit differently and having some different perspectives, because we all know that we have over-reliance on the research and the data and the evidence that suits our bias in the first place. If we think a certain way, we always go to that person's piece of research to reinforce what we've always been thinking anyway. So the ability of ChatGPT, one of the things we're really interested in is how it can make us think through a different lens or a different perspective, because we're in the kind of school that we're in, an innovative learning environment, we appeal to a certain sort of educator. We know we have to protect ourselves from that potential for something of an echo chamber as well, which is a really exciting application.
So the other really big thing that this all raises is actually how knowledgeable, I'm choosing my words carefully, are our schools around change management. But I know that you use design thinking at Albany Senior High, and I trained in design thinking at Network for Learning. I know when I was running a school, which I finished that in 2013, but I remember that we would get I remember our first computers on wheels of laptops that we got. And I remember I had no idea how that journey of change was going to roll out, and I didn't know how to do that either. And so I think we kind of put them in, and I think I probably crossed my fingers, eyes and toes and thought, I hope this works.
Yeah.
But the change is happening so fast, and what we are dealing with schools is so much more difficult now, more challenging. We actually need really good models around change and models that actually work. And so one of those is design thinking, but it's actually, how do you apply design thinking to change within schools?
Well, I've had a real concern building for the last couple of years as well, is that our whole narrative around futures thinking has dried up. So 5-6 years ago, there was a whole group of us that were incredibly invested in things like Singularity U, going across to EduTech and future schools, and participating in these incredible sort of festivals of the future type events. And then I think, COVID came along. We all thought it was going to be the great disruptor that would transform how we do things. And then, of course, some things did change. A lot went back to how it was. And it's like futures thinking fatigue set in at just the time when the curve is spiking up. So just when we should be embracing a lot of that proactive learning about futures thinking and different futures and, alternate futures, we've stopped having those conversations, it feels like. Like, I don't know about you, like I really miss those opportunities we had when we did go to things like Singularity U and learn from people outside our sector. Like one thing that I think you've probably gained a huge amount from is that you've got lessons of leadership that go beyond education. I often worry that educational leaders aren't looking outside schools for their models of leadership and their thinking, you know what I mean? Like, we get so bogged down in the minutiae of ministry changes, frustrations about property, all of this, that we sometimes don't feel like we have the cognitive or physical space to engage in futures thinking that goes beyond school.
And there's a whole lot of research. In fact, I've also set up a thing called Leaders CoLab, which is a 10 masterclasses across the year that people, that schools actually pay to belong to Leaders CoLab. And it's a way to engage in a networked way with different ideas. And we started actually last week, and the theme that I chose for our first Leaders CoLab engagement was actually future self. Because there's a whole lot of research that talks about, we recognize that our past self is different from our present self, okay? But there's this lovely quote, which I don't know off by heart, but basically it says, humans are actually a work in progress that think that they're finished. And so what this future self work does is look at and say, so if this is my present self, if I'm not a finished work, what does my future self look like? Because it's actually our future self that drives us forward. And so I think what you raise is incredibly important, because if we don't actually start to, or if we can't conceptualize what future education might look like, then we're stuck. We're stuck with what we've got now. And it's really hard to do and I am really worried about this, because I look at how overwhelmed and overworked our school leaders are. And there's just no space to even start to conceptualize what future me looks like.
And it's made even harder when governments come along and nearly always come up with backwards looking simple solutions to complex problems, and that's not encouraging any of us to think in a disruptive way and to embrace disruption and to embrace the potential for change, and the fact that it can be really exciting. Like, I feel like we've lost that sort of, and a lot of it is because people are tired and life is hard and we've got a lot of pressures going on, but actually getting excited about what could be or should be is really good for your well-being as well.
Absolutely, because it's fresh and it's new, and it gives, and you know what's really important? It gives you hope for the future, and that optimism, that hope that tomorrow will be different. That's actually what drives us forward. So one of, but it comes also back to actually understanding how change works, and actually doing change in a way that it will be successful, not actually just wear the people out more. So some of the other things that I'm thinking about at the moment is, is what workshops with groups of school leaders could look like, that actually gives the space to explore what does future me look like, but how does future me also look like in terms of what does future learning look like in our school. But I take your point, it's incredibly difficult when you've got education being politicized, which
and there's the tensions, isn't there?
There's a huge tension, and I think that, but also one of the things I learned when I went to NFL is that education actually has a culture all of its own, and while you're in it, you don't even know that it's there. It's like a fish in a bowl. It doesn't know the water's there until you take the water away and say, oh, something's missing. Right, and so that was one of the biggest things I learned when I was working at NFL, is that education has such a culture to it, which is good, and it's also bad, because as you said, we've got to look outside education sometimes for the way forward. And I think there is. I know there's a huge amount that I learnt at NFL that I wished I'd known when I was running a school. And in fact, that's why when I left NFL, I started up my own company, or my own design thinking and leadership practice, was actually to try and take some of those things that I learned and actually give them back to the sector. You know, I just do not know how many times I would sit and you know what the NFL offices were like in Parnell in Auckland, and I'd sit and go, oh man, wished I'd known this when I was running a school. And it's that's the value of actually having people who have had experience outside education coming back to education to impart new learnings. And it's
so
not, yeah.
I'm aware that, you know, unsurprisingly, we could talk forever and it could keep on going and going. But in closing, like, obviously people can engage with you, get in touch. You've got your workshops that you offer. You've got your fabulous book, The Leader's Suitcase. There's going to be a couple more books coming down the pipeline. So I'll make sure I have your contact details below. But just in closing, can you share us one little nuggety nugget of one thing you wish you knew when you were a principal that you learned when you stepped out of principalship?
Easy, is stay ahead of the story. That when something's happening, you actually get out in front of it and you tell the story the way you want it to be told. Because so often something's happening, you hear a rumor out in the community, or something is going down, or a teacher's about to leave, or whatever. Get out and tell your story, because if you don't tell the story, someone else will.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carolyn, for making time this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's stuck with us throughout the podcast here today. As always, please shout out if there's someone you'd love to hear from, or if you'd love to join the conversation online. So in closing, thank you to our listeners, and ka kite.
Mā te wā.